Hurricane Harvey made landfall on Texas on August 25th, inflicting $125 billion in damage, making it the second costliest hurricane to hit the U.S. ever recorded. Everyone across the country was quick to react as relief teams flooded the area, federal aid packages were approved, and donations came pouring in, as the damage and recovery process was widely covered in the media. Hurricane Irma struck soon afterwards, clipping the north end of Puerto Rico on September 6th as a Category 5 storm, leaving 1 million people there without electricity, and making landfall on the Florida mainland on September 10th after having weakened into a Category 3 storm. The following day, it weakened significantly into a tropical storm before dissipating over Tennessee on September 13th, but not before causing over $50 billion in damage. Again, relief teams arrived in droves, aid was approved, and donations were made en masse, and the media came swarming in. There was little time to recover before a third hurricane, one of the most devastating in U.S. history, developed. Hurricane Maria made direct landfall on Puerto Rico on September 20th, by which time 60,000 on the island were still without power. The storm passed over Puerto Rico at almost peak intensity, its center passing just 25 miles away from San Juan, Puerto Rico's capital, which is home to 400,000 people. Hurricane Maria ravaged the islands and exacerbated damage caused by Hurricane Irma a few weeks prior, with 155 mile-per-hour winds that amounted to nearly Category 5 strength. As the fifth strongest storm to ever hit the U.S. and the strongest storm to hit Puerto Rico in 80 years, Hurricane Maria caused unprecedented levels of widespread destruction and disorganization, wiping out much of Puerto Rico's infrastructure, including almost the entirety of Puerto Rico's electrical grid. Because of this, Hurricane Maria was a different class of disaster from Hurricane Harvey and Irma, as the hurricane left people of Puerto Rico in a desperate humanitarian crisis. Puerto Ricans were left stranded on the island with no electricity, no food, no clean water, and no communication. Maria wiped out 80% of Puerto Rico's power lines, and due to the lack of electricity and damaged systems, there were massive water shortages, and the majority of those on the island didn't have access to clean water. Farms were also decimated by the storm, wiping out 80% of crop value, contributing further to high food prices and massive food shortages. In addition, Maria knocked out 1,360 of the 1,600 cell towers on the island, isolating many communities and hampering relief efforts. Most hospitals were also running on generators with limited fuel after the hurricane hit, which limited access to life-saving equipment and contributed to the growing health crisis. Because of the widespread destruction of the storm, the recovery process was made difficult, especially after the decimation of roads and other transportation systems on the island. Many efforts were hindered by the lack of power or proper communication systems. Many were forced to find other sources of water, including contaminated streams. FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was distributing bottled water, but at a number far below meeting the needs of the people. A month after the storm had developed, municipal water services had been only restored to 72% of the island. Around 86% of the 1.57 million electricity customers on the island were still without power, 20% of the gas stations were still closed, and FEMA was providing 200,000 meals a day but falling 2 million meals short. 44% of Puerto Ricans didn't have power for over 3 months. However, there were also other factors at play affecting the slow and inadequate recovery process. A year after Hurricane Maria struck, tens of thousands in Puerto Rico were still living under blue tarps, yet a federal court decision on August 30th, 2018, declared that Puerto Ricans temporarily housed in the U.S. would lose FEMA support on the 15th of September. Just days prior, Puerto Rico's governor had revised the official death count from 64 to 2,975, and previous studies has estimated the death count to be even higher. Trump denied the numbers and suggested that the U.S. Democratic Party was falsifying the numbers, instead calling the federal response to Hurricane Maria an unsung success. Throughout Puerto Rico's recovery process, U.S. President Donald Trump has campaigned against Puerto Rico, from his initial silence and inaction to Twitter wars with Puerto Rican officials. The political dialogue following Hurricane Maria is very revealing of the priorities of the U.S. government. Shortly after Maria struck Puerto Rico, Jeremy Konyndyk, the former top disaster response official at USAID under former President Barack Obama, said in an interview, "On Texas and Florida, during Hurricane Irma, the president was very vocal and engaged in the run-up to the storm. His messaging was frankly pretty good. If you look at his public messaging on a comparable timeline around Puerto Rico, there's virtually nothing. That sends a signal to the whole federal bureaucracy about how they should prioritize." In a press conference on September 29, 2017, Carmen Yulín Cruz, the mayor of San Juan, pleading for more aid and recognition for Puerto Rico,
to take charge and save lives. We are dying here. What we are going to see is something close to a genocide.
This prompted Trump to finally break his silence, unleashing a series of tweets repeatedly blaming Puerto Rico for its situation and criticizing the mayor of San Juan, who is an outspoken critic of the federal response to Maria, for having poor leadership. Throughout an ongoing crisis in Puerto Rico, Trump continued to blame the island for its own financial crisis in an effort to cover up the federal government's incommensurate and deficient relief effort, saying, "Puerto Rico survived the hurricanes, now a financial crisis looms, largely of their own making." He also tweeted, "Texas and Florida are doing great, but Puerto Rico, which was already suffering from broken infrastructure and massive debt, is in deep trouble." While it is true that Puerto Rico was already in a difficult economic situation before the hurricane even struck, the issue is far more deeply rooted in Puerto Rico's history and relationship with the United States. It all goes back to the Spanish-American War in 1898, a 4-month-long war in which the U.S. gained a number of Spanish colonies. On August 12, 1898, Spain and the U.S. came to an agreement that officially ceded Puerto Rico to the U.S., and the Treaty of Paris was signed on December 10th of that same year. However, Puerto Rico's voice was not sought on the matter, violating the very principles upon which the U.S. Declaration of Independence was written, which asserts that the governments only derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. From then on out, Puerto Rico's status has been constantly in question, changing many numbers of times. First, Puerto Rico was an occupied territory of the U.S., then an unincorporated territory, then an organized unincorporated territory in 1917, when President Wilson signed the Jones-Shafroth Act, which created a more autonomous government for Puerto Rico, though still under federal rule. The Jones-Shafroth Act also extended some U.S. constitutional rights to Puerto Ricans and stated that they are hereby declared and shall be deemed and held to be citizens of the United States. In 1952, the Constitution of Puerto Rico officially established Puerto Rico as a Commonwealth of the United States, a status which Puerto Rico still holds today. Currently, Puerto Rico remains essentially, though not in title, a U.S. colony, as Puerto Ricans do not have full rights under the Constitution. They are protected by the same Bill of Rights and can vote in the same presidential primaries, but Puerto Rico doesn't have electoral votes, nor does the island have any voting power in Congress. Jennifer Gonzalez-Collin, the resident commissioner of Puerto Rico, serves in the House of Representatives as only a non-voting member. Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States remains an issue of contention as well. Through the 20th century, there have been many movements in Puerto Rico for independence which have consistently been denied support from the U.S. government, as well as not getting enough support from the Puerto Rican people themselves. Puerto Rico has also held official votes on its status in 1967, 1991, 1993, and 1998, and in 2012, for the first time, the majority vote was to discontinue status as a U.S. territory in favor of statehood. In June 2017, 97% of voters in Puerto Rico actually voted in favor of statehood. However, only 23% of registered voters participated. But more importantly, Puerto Rico does not have the legal authority to rule over its own fate, as the power to do so remains in the U.S. Congress, in which Puerto Rico has no voting representation. The strained and complicated relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico and the biases that have stemmed from it have most certainly contributed to the inadequacy of aid Puerto Rico has received. In addition, the ignorance of American voters has also played a factor. According to a poll published in the New York Times in October 2017, only 54% of Americans know that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens as well. Furthermore, the poll found that of those who knew Puerto Ricans to be U.S. citizens, 81% supported sending aid to the island, while only 44% of those who didn't know also supported sending aid. Trump's widely publicized Twitter campaign against Puerto Rico has not helped garner support for Puerto Rico either, but has only spread the common perception that Puerto Rico is an entity separate from the United States and not deserving the same support. There is no doubt that Puerto Rico gets treated differently to a state, and there is no doubt that it has been true for the disaster response as well, Puerto Rican Governor Ricardo Rossello said in an interview. Our objective is to eradicate this notion of second-class citizenship in the United States, so that whenever a disaster hits, whether it's in Texas, Florida, New York, or Puerto Rico, the federal government responds equally in all cases. With this in mind, the Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, signed into law in 1988, requires the federal government to treat Puerto Rico like a state when responding to major disasters, dictating equal relief response. However, this was not the case. When we compare the federal response to Hurricane Maria with responses to Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma, we found a significant disparity in the reaction time and the amount of resources committed to each disaster relief effort. This is clearly shown in a few simple statistics. 9 days after each disaster, the federal government also had 30,000 personnel in the Houston region at this point, in contrast with the 10,000 personnel in Puerto Rico. Within 10 days of Harvey, FEMA approved permanent disaster work for Texas, while the organization didn't approve permanent disaster work for Puerto Rico for 43 days. Furthermore, the disaster responses didn't reflect the severity of the damages caused by each hurricane. While the damages in Texas and Florida were more costly, the high damage estimate for Puerto Rico reflects the widespread devastation of vegetation, housing, and infrastructure. The casualties that resulted from Hurricane Maria also far exceeded those caused by Irma or Harvey. However, there were far more personnel present in Florida and Texas than Puerto Rico, and the cumulative federal spending for Harvey far exceeded that for Maria. A retrospective analysis study conducted by the BMJ Global Health Organization concluded that the disaster responses to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria were different to the degree that they do not align with storm severity or prevention and recovery needs, and may substantially affect deaths and recovery rates. The study further purported that the disaster relief for Puerto Rico was undermined by the political agendas of those in the U.S. government, which resulted in governmental action that was not aligned with need, due in likeliness to issues of citizenship, disaster fatigue, race and ethnicity, and previous biases and strained relationships with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has been in a humanitarian crisis since Maria hit, yet more aid was only recently approved and not without a struggle. Since Maria struck in 2017, $40.8 billion has been allocated in aid to Puerto Rico, and $11.2 billion of that has been spent. The Office of Management and Budget has estimated about $50 billion in Stafford liabilities or additional aid that will be needed in the next 20 years to fully rebuild. The issue of aid to Puerto Rico has since left Congress divided, and in recent years there has been a growing trend in the increasing politicization of what should be humanitarian issues, delaying and preventing critical measures from being put into place. After months upon months of inaction by Congress, House Democrats, joined by 34 House Republicans, passed a massive $19.1 billion emergency relief package on May 10th for millions of Americans awaiting aid after a slew of hurricanes, wildfires, and floods, as well as for farmers affected by the ongoing trade war. However, Trump continued to be a roadblock in approving any legislation, as he actively railed against any legislation assisting Puerto Rico in the recovery process. Trump requested that $4.5 billion be set aside for the border, further complicating negotiations. On May 23rd, after a long debate, the Senate finally approved a bipartisan version of the $19.1 billion relief bill. This new aid package allocates $1.4 billion to Puerto Rico, including $600 million in nutritional assistance with nothing to be given for border aid. The bill, expected to quickly passed through the House of Representatives, was delayed yet again, however, as the House was on partial recess and failed to pass the bill by unanimous consent. Once the House was fully back in session, the package was finally approved, and on June 6th, President Trump signed the bill. He, of course, attempted to take credit for the aid to Puerto Rico, which he had opposed for years. While the passage of this disaster relief bill is a milestone in Puerto Rico's recovery process, it is not enough. It will take more funds and a greater relief effort to rebuild. It has been over a year and a half since Maria hit Puerto Rico, but Congress has been stuck in back and forth debates over aid packages while millions of Americans have been left in limbo. As a result of this fight, people's efforts to rebuild were left hanging in the balance while the partisan squabbles continued, and the politicization of this fight doesn't bode well for the next time Americans may need help after a natural disaster.